She was 22 years old, sitting on a plastic chair outside a hospital room, wearing the same jacket she had worn 3 days in a row. Her eyes were swollen. Not from sleep. From everything that wasn't sleep. She hadn't eaten since the morning before. Her phone showed a missed call from her landlord, 2 from her boss, and a text from a number she didn't recognize that simply said, "The bill has been taken care of. Don't worry." She stared at that message for a long time. She read it again. Then she looked up at the ceiling and started to cry. Not because she was sad. Because for the first time in 3 years, someone had told her not to worry. And she had no idea who that someone was. Across the parking lot, a black SUV sat quietly in the far corner. And inside it, an older man in a gray coat watched the entrance of that hospital without blinking. He had been sitting there for over an hour. His driver glanced at him through the rearview mirror and said nothing. Because he already knew. His employer had been watching over that young woman for years. And she had never once noticed him. Before this story is over, you are going to ask yourself 3 questions. Who is this man? Why has he spent years quietly protecting someone who doesn't even know his name? And what kind of debt is so heavy that a man carries it alone for over 2 decades without ever once asking for a thank you? The answer to all 3 questions begins on a cold Tuesday morning in November, the year 2001. And to understand it fully, we have to go back to a highway just outside of Cedar Falls, Iowa, where a pickup truck, a father, and a split-second decision changed the course of 2 families' lives forever. Before we go any further with Emily's story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel, and honestly, some of the places our viewers watch from genuinely surprise us every single time. Drop your city, your country, wherever you are right now, write down in the comments below. And if you are new here and this kind of story is what you've been looking for, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Emily Carter. And if you passed her on the street, you might not think twice about her. She wasn't loud. She wasn't the kind of person who walked into a room and turned heads. She was the kind of person who held the elevator for strangers, left exact change on the counter at the diner, and remembered the name of every nurse who had ever treated her grandmother. She was the kind of person this world too often overlooks. Emily grew up in a small rental house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were small and the cars were old and everyone knew which families were struggling without ever having to be told. She was raised by her parents, Daniel and Ruth Carter, and by all accounts, her early childhood was simple but full of warmth. Her father Daniel worked 2 jobs. He drove a school bus during the week and did weekend shifts at a lumber yard on the edge of town. Her mother Ruth cleaned rooms at a motel off the interstate and sold handmade candles at the local farmers market every other Saturday. They were not rich. But they were kind people who made sure Emily never felt the weight of what they didn't have. Emily was 7 years old when her father died. She didn't fully understand it at the time. She just knew that one morning he left the house and did not come back. She remembered sitting at the kitchen table waiting for the sound of his boots on the porch steps. She remembered the way her mother's face changed when 2 police officers knocked on the door that evening. She remembered the smell of the casserole a neighbor brought over the next day, and how nobody ate it. That was the first chapter of a life that would demand more from Emily Carter than any young person should ever have to give. Her mother Ruth tried her best. She picked up extra shifts, took in ironing from neighbors, and refused every offer of charity that came her way, not out of pride exactly, but out of a deep-seated belief that their family would find its footing again. For a few years, it seemed like they might. Emily was a good student. She loved to read, she helped her mother without being asked, and she had a quiet resilience that her teachers often remarked on in parent-teacher conferences. But when Emily was 14, her mother was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And just like that, the ground shifted again. By the time Emily was 18, she was the one working. She waited tables at a diner 4 mornings a week and stocked shelves at a grocery store on weekends. She took 2 community college courses at night. She was also her mother's primary caregiver, which meant she cooked, she cleaned, she managed medications, she sat beside Ruth during the bad days when walking from the bedroom to the kitchen felt like climbing a mountain. And she did all of this without complaint. Not because she didn't feel the exhaustion. She felt it every single day. But because there was simply no one else. When Emily was 20 years old, her mother Ruth passed away quietly in her sleep on a Thursday night in March. And the only family Emily had left in the world was her maternal grandmother, a 73-year-old woman named Eleanor who lived 40 minutes away in a small apartment in Waterloo, Iowa. Eleanor had arthritis, a heart condition, and a stubbornness about her independence that her doctors found professionally frustrating. And Emily loved her completely. So that is who Emily Carter was at 22. She worked the breakfast shift at a diner called May's on Willowbrook Avenue and a second job 3 evenings a week doing data entry for a small insurance office. She lived in a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the heating system was unreliable and the elevator hadn't worked since the previous winter. She took the bus everywhere. She brought her grandmother groceries every Sunday. She smiled at strangers, tipped generously even when she couldn't really afford to, and had not taken a single day off in nearly 8 months. And she had absolutely no idea that her life had been quietly, invisibly protected by a man she had never spoken to. His name was Robert Hale. And in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Robert Hale was not an anonymous man. He was the founder and majority owner of Hale Industrial Group, a manufacturing and logistics company with operations in 11 states. He was 61 years old at the time this story takes place. He had a 4-bedroom house on the quiet side of Cedar Falls, a small cabin in Wisconsin he rarely visited, and a net worth that local newspapers had estimated at somewhere north of $400 million. He had never married. He had no children. His personal assistant had worked for him for 19 years and had long ago stopped asking him why he spent so much time sitting in parked cars outside hospitals, diners, and bus stops. Because Robert Hale never answered that question. He simply looked out the window and said nothing. If you had watched him on the mornings he followed Emily's routine, you would have found the image almost strange. A man of his wealth, sitting in the back seat of a black SUV in the parking lot of May's Diner, or nursing a cup of coffee alone at the counter of a coffee shop 3 blocks from Emily's apartment building, always careful to sit where he could see the entrance, always careful to leave before she could notice him. He had been doing this, in one form or another, since Emily was 9 years old. Not every day. Not even every week. But with enough consistency that his driver Marcus had learned to recognize the route without being told. Down Willowbrook, past the diner, left at the light near the hospital, sometimes a slow pass by the community college, and then back home. Robert would sit in silence the whole way. Sometimes Marcus caught him in the rearview mirror with his jaw set and his eyes fixed on nothing in particular, the way a man looks when he is carrying something heavy and has been carrying it for so long that he no longer remembers what it felt like to put it down. Emily had registered him exactly twice in 3 years. Once at the diner, where she had brought him black coffee without being asked because he had the look of a man who drank his coffee black. He had said thank you quietly and left a $20 bill on a $7 tab, which she appreciated but didn't think much about. And once at the bus stop on Harrison Street on a rainy October evening, where he had been standing without an umbrella and she had offered to share hers. He had declined politely and she had gone on her way. She had not remembered either encounter in any lasting way. He was simply a well-dressed older gentleman. The world was full of them. But nothing about Robert Hale's interest in Emily Carter was casual. And the deeper this story goes, the more you will understand just how heavy a promise can become when it is made over a dying man's body on the side of a highway in November. The first time Emily nearly lost her apartment, she was 20 years old. Her mother had just died 6 weeks earlier and Emily had missed 2 weeks of work to handle the funeral arrangements, the paperwork, and the grief that settled over her like weather she couldn't outrun. When she came back to her shifts at May's, her tips were slow and her data entry job had reduced her hours because the insurance office was going through a quiet restructuring. She was $340 short on rent. She had already called the landlord, a man named Doug who was not unkind but who had a mortgage of his own to meet, and he had given her until the end of the week. She spent 2 days trying to figure it out. She looked into emergency assistance programs and found that the waiting lists were long. She thought about calling her grandmother Eleanor, but Eleanor was living on a fixed income herself and Emily refused to add to that burden. She thought about asking a coworker at the diner named Patrice who had become a kind of older sister figure to her, but Patrice had 3 kids and Emily already knew the answer would be a warm apology. And then, on the 4th day, Doug called her. He told her the rent had been paid. All of it. Paid in cash at the management office the evening before. Nobody had left a name. He seemed as surprised as she was. Emily stood in her kitchen for a full minute after that phone call, holding her phone to her chest and staring at the wall. She ran through every person she knew. Her co-workers, her neighbors, a childhood friend from school she still texted sometimes. None of them had the kind of money that would be paid so casually, in cash, without a word. She even wondered briefly if it had been a clerical error, some other tenant's payment filed to the wrong unit. But Doug checked. It wasn't. Someone had walked into that management office and paid Emily Carter's rent. And then walked away. 3 weeks later, a bag of groceries appeared outside her apartment door. Fresh produce, canned goods, a box of the exact tea that Emily's mother used to buy. She had no idea how anyone would know that. She asked every neighbor on the floor. Nobody had seen anything. 2 months after that, a bill from her mother's final hospitalization, one that had somehow slipped through the gaps in the insurance and been forwarded to Emily's address for collection, a bill for $6,200, was marked paid in full by an anonymous third party. Emily called the billing department 3 times to make sure it was real. It was. Paid in full. No name. No contact information. She told herself it might be a charity, some kind of local benevolent fund she had never heard of. She convinced herself there was a rational explanation. But somewhere deeper than logic, she felt something she could not name. Something that felt less like luck and more like being watched over. And she didn't know yet whether that feeling should comfort her or frighten her. But there was something else. Something she didn't know about. In the lobby of her apartment building, there was a small security camera above the main entrance. On the evening that someone had paid her rent, the building manager had reviewed the footage as a routine check. The footage showed a tall man in a gray coat walking through the lobby at 8:47 in the evening, his head tilted slightly away from the camera. His face was partially obscured. The manager noted it, filed it, and forgot about it. He had no reason to connect it to anything. But the footage existed. And one day, it would matter. It was Patrice who first said it out loud. Emily was on a break between tables one slow Tuesday morning at Maze, telling Patrice about the most recent thing that had happened, a check for $800 that had appeared in her mailbox in a plain white envelope with no return address, only her name written in careful block letters on the front. Patrice leaned against the counter and looked at her with the particular expression of a woman who has seen enough of the world to know when something doesn't add up. She said, "Baby, that's not a charity. Charities send letters. Charities want you to know it was them. This is somebody specific. Somebody who knows you." And Emily looked at her and felt the full weight of that land somewhere in her stomach. She started paying attention differently after that. She started noticing things she had let slide past her before. The coffee shop 3 blocks from her building where she had once seen a well-dressed older man reading a newspaper. The diner where she worked and the same man had sat at the counter twice in 4 months and always left generous tips and always left quickly. The bus stop on Harrison Street in the rain. She began to piece together a shape from these fragments. Tall, gray-haired, well-dressed but not flashy. Always alone. Always watching, but in a way that looked like he was trying not to watch. She started asking around quietly. She described him to her neighbor Mrs. Gaines, who had lived in the building for 11 years. Mrs. Gaines thought for a moment and said she might have seen him in the parking lot once, just sitting in a big dark car. But she hadn't thought anything of it. Emily asked the other waitresses at Maze. 3 of them remembered him. He came in about once a month. Always black coffee. Always polite. Always paid in cash. One of the younger waitresses, a 19-year-old named Chelsea, said she had noticed that whenever he came in, he always sat at a table with a clear view of Emily's section. Chelsea had thought he was just another lonely older customer with a crush. Emily had brushed that off at the time. Now she wasn't so sure. She went to the management office of her apartment building and asked if there was security footage from the evening her rent had been paid anonymously. The manager was surprised by the request but pulled it up. Emily stood in front of a small screen and watched a tall man in a gray coat walk through the lobby at 8:47 at night, his face partially turned away. She couldn't see him clearly enough to be certain. But something about the shape of him, the particular way he held himself, felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. She went home that night and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a long time. She thought about her mother. She thought about her father, who had died when she was too young to remember him clearly, who existed in her mind mostly as a smell of cedar wood and motor oil and a warmth she had no specific memory to attach it to. She thought about the grocery bag with her mother's tea inside it. And she thought about how it was not possible for a random charity to know which brand of tea Ruth Carter used to buy. Someone had known her family. Someone had known them closely enough to remember a detail like that. And whoever that person was, they had been quietly standing between Emily and disaster for at least 2 years. Possibly longer. She decided she was going to find out who it was. If this part is making sense, drop a comment with, "I'm still here." Let's see who's really watching to this point. We read as many comments as we can and don't forget to leave a like on this video. She started methodically. She called every local charitable organization she could find. None had any record of payments made on her behalf. She spoke to a community outreach worker at her church who was familiar with most of the local assistance programs and had never heard of anonymous cash payments made directly to landlords and billing departments. She pulled every memory she had of her mother Ruth talking about friends, neighbors, people from the old neighborhood, anyone who might have had a connection to the family strong enough to do something like this. Ruth had been a private woman who kept a small circle. There was a co-worker from the motel named Sandra. A pastor named Reverend Thomas. A neighbor from the house Emily grew up in, an older man named Mr. Calhoun who had since moved away. None of them, when she quietly reached out, knew anything. And then one afternoon, Emily was going through a box of her mother's things that she had kept in the top of her closet since the move, documents mostly, old utility bills, an expired car insurance policy, a small photo album. Inside the album, buried between a photograph of Ruth at her high school graduation and a picture of Emily's parents on their wedding day, was a newspaper clipping. It was from the Cedar Falls Gazette, dated November 9, 2001. The headline read, "Local man credited with saving driver's life in highway accident." And below the headline was a photograph of Emily's father, Daniel Carter, standing beside a highway patrol officer. He was 31 years old in the photograph. He was smiling. Emily sat on the floor of her apartment and read the article 3 times without breathing very much. Now we have to leave Emily for a moment. Because to understand what she was about to discover, you need to understand who Robert Hale was before the money, before the company, before the gray coat and the black SUV and the quiet vigils outside hospital windows. You need to understand who he was on the morning of November 9, 2001. When he was 38 years old and his pickup truck left the road on Iowa State Highway 20, 8 miles west of Cedar Falls, during a sudden patch of black ice. Robert had been driving back from a business meeting in Des Moines. He had started early that morning and he was tired. The heater in his truck was running too warm and the radio had been a quiet drone of morning news he wasn't really listening to. He remembers the moment the truck began to slide as a feeling of absolute unreality, like the world had suddenly stopped following its own rules. The truck hit the guardrail, broke through it, and rolled twice into the ditch below the embankment. He lost consciousness on the second roll. He came to on his back in the November cold with the smell of radiator fluid and something burning nearby. He couldn't move his legs. He could hear the sound of the highway above him but he couldn't see anyone and he couldn't make his voice carry. He lay there in the cold and the silence and he told himself later that during those minutes he had started to believe he was going to die there. Not dramatically. Just quietly, in the cold, at 38 years old, before he had done anything that truly mattered. And then Daniel Carter appeared at the edge of the embankment. Daniel had been driving in the opposite direction and had seen the guardrail break. He had pulled over, climbed down the steep embankment in November mud, reached Robert's truck, and spent 20 minutes talking to a stranger he had never met, keeping him conscious, keeping him calm, and then helping to free him from the wreckage before the ambulance arrived. The paramedics later told Robert that if he had lost consciousness again and aspirated, it was unlikely he would have survived. Daniel Carter had kept him alive by staying with him and refusing to leave. Robert had been hospitalized for 11 days with a broken collarbone, 3 fractured ribs, and a concussion. He was discharged 2 days before Thanksgiving. He tried to find Daniel to thank him. It took him 3 weeks. And when he finally tracked him down and called the number he had gotten from a mutual contact at the county road office, the phone was answered by Ruth Carter. She told Robert, in a voice that was careful and steady in the way of people who have recently learned to be careful and steady because they have no other choice, that Daniel had died in a separate accident on November 19, 10 days after the highway rescue. A construction site accident at the lumber yard. A forklift. He had been 31 years old. He left behind a wife and a 7-year-old daughter. Robert Hale sat with that information for a long time. He tried to give Ruth money. She refused. He tried twice more over the following year. She refused each time with a quiet dignity that he later described as the most humbling experience of his adult life. But he could not leave it alone. Because he believed, in a way that settled into him like something structural, that he was alive because Daniel Carter had climbed down an embankment in the cold for a total stranger. And Daniel Carter's daughter was now growing up without a father. He could not fix that. But he could do the other thing. He could be there when the world tilted against her in the ways that were his to prevent. So he stayed. Quietly. In the background. In gray coats and dark cars and plain white envelopes. For 15 years. He kept a photograph in his wallet. It was creased and worn at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. It was a copy of the photograph from the newspaper clipping, a printout on regular paper, edges gone soft from years in his coat pocket. Daniel Carter, 31 years old, standing beside a highway patrol officer, smiling. Robert had never told anyone about this photograph. He had never explained it to his driver Marcus or his personal assistant Joanne or the 2 people in his life who might have called themselves his close friends. It was not the kind of thing that fit into normal conversation. It was the kind of thing you carry alone because no other arrangement seems right. Emily found his name on the 3rd page of the newspaper article. The article mentioned that the driver who had been rescued from the wreck had later expressed gratitude through the local sheriff's department but had requested anonymity at the time of publication. His name was not printed in the original article. But Emily's mother had written something in pencil in the margin of the clipping, in Ruth's neat, small handwriting, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a woman who had been careful about everything. It said simply, "R. Hale called again. Said no to the money again. He means well." Emily stared at those words for a very long time. She typed the name into her phone. Robert Hale, Cedar Falls, Iowa. The results came back immediately. Hale Industrial Group. $400 million. Headquarters on the east side of Cedar Falls. A man who had built a manufacturing empire from a single contract in his late 30s. A man who had no family listed. No wife. No children. A man who had once been the subject of a brief local news profile in which he had said, when asked about philanthropy, that he believed the most meaningful giving was the kind that didn't require a press release. She found his office address. She did not call ahead. She took the number 14 bus across town on a Wednesday morning when she was supposed to be at her data entry job, and she walked into the lobby of Hale Industrial Group in the same jacket she always wore and asked the receptionist if she could speak to Robert Hale. The receptionist looked at her with polite confusion and said that Mr. Hale didn't take unscheduled appointments. Emily said she understood, and then she said her name. Emily Carter. Daughter of Daniel Carter. She watched the receptionist's face go through something complicated in the space of about 3 seconds. She was shown to a waiting room. She sat there for 22 minutes. And then a door opened and Robert Hale walked in, and he stopped when he saw her, the way a person stops when they have been expecting something and are still somehow not prepared for it. He was tall, gray-haired, well-dressed but not flashy. He was wearing a gray coat. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite grief and not quite relief but contained elements of all 3. And Emily looked at him and recognized, with a strange calm certainty, that she had handed this man a cup of black coffee once without knowing why she chose to do it without asking. She had offered him her umbrella on Harrison Street. She had walked past him a dozen times in 3 years and had never once understood what she was walking past. She said, "You've been paying my bills." It was not a question. He looked at her steadily for a moment. And then he said, "Your father saved my life. I couldn't repay him. So I've been trying to keep the promise I made at his grave instead." She had not expected him to say that. "What promise?" she asked. He said, "I told him I would look out for you. As long as you needed it. And that I would never make it a burden you had to carry." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "He doesn't know you did any of this." Robert said quietly, "No. But I think he would have thought it was enough." Emily left that building without knowing what she felt. She walked 6 blocks before she realized she had gone in the wrong direction for the bus. She stood on a corner she didn't recognize and the cold November air smelled faintly of motor oil, and she didn't know why that felt significant until she remembered that her father had always smelled of motor oil when he came home from the lumber yard. And then she cried on a street corner in Cedar Falls in the middle of a Wednesday morning, not because she was sad, but because the world had just revealed a shape to her that she hadn't known was there, a shape that had been quietly present for 15 years, patient and unannounced, like a roof over her head she had never thought to look up and see. Now let us go back even further. Because the full picture of what Daniel Carter did on November 9, 2001, is not captured in a newspaper headline. And to feel the real weight of this story, you need to know what kind of man he was and what kind of day it was for him when he climbed down that embankment. Emily would learn most of this later, piecing it together from conversations with Robert and from old letters her mother had kept in a shoebox at the back of her closet that Emily had never previously opened, because grief is like that. You leave certain boxes closed for years because you're not ready for what's in them. Daniel Carter had, by every account, been an ordinary man in all the ways that matter most. He was not ambitious in the way the world usually rewards. He was not trying to build something or become something. He was a school bus driver and a lumber yard worker who coached youth soccer on Saturday mornings and made pancakes on Sunday without being asked, and who sent cards for every birthday in his family without fail. Ruth had once described him in a letter to her own mother as the kind of man who makes everything around him quieter in a good way. Emily had read that and held it for a long time. On the morning of November 9, 2001, Daniel had been driving back from an early lumber delivery and was running late for his bus route. He almost didn't stop. He told Ruth that evening. He had seen the guardrail break from half a mile back and his first thought was that someone else would stop, that a highway patrol car would be there in minutes, that his bus kids were waiting. He almost kept driving. And then something in him, some pull he couldn't articulate, made him slow down. He told Ruth it wasn't heroism. He said he just couldn't drive past a man who might be dying and be the person who didn't stop. That was Daniel Carter. He was unable to be the person who didn't stop. Robert Hale had visited Daniel's grave on the anniversary of the accident every year for 14 years. Not November 19th, the day Daniel died, but November 9th, the day Daniel chose to stop. He had never told anyone this. He brought no flowers. He simply stood there for a few minutes in whatever weather November had to offer and then drove home. His driver Marcus had been with him for 12 of those 14 years and had made the drive to the cemetery without ever asking for an explanation. Some things don't need explaining. Some things are their own explanation. When Robert finally told Emily all of this, sitting across from her in a quiet corner booth of a diner she had suggested because it was the only neutral ground she could think of, she asked him why he had never introduced himself. Why he had never simply knocked on her door or written a letter or found a way to let her know. And he was quiet for a while before he answered. He said, "Because I was afraid you would tell me to stop. And I wasn't ready to stop. Not yet." And Emily thought about that. About what it means to need to do something for someone else more than you need their acknowledgement. About the way certain debts become something close to a vocation. And she didn't say anything for a while either, because some answers deserve a moment of quiet. Emily's grandmother Eleanor had been hospitalized for the second time that year in October. Her heart condition had worsened and the cardiologist at Mercy Medical Center in Waterloo was recommending a procedure that Eleanor's Medicare coverage would only partially cover. The remainder, approximately $14,000, had been a source of silent terror for Emily for 3 weeks. She had not told anyone. She had been doing the math in her head at every quiet moment, during bus rides, during breakfast shifts, during the moments just before sleep when the mind has nothing left to defend itself with. She had no answer to that math. There was no version of her current circumstances that produced $14,000. 3 days after her meeting with Robert Hale, she received a call from the billing department at Mercy Medical Center informing her that the outstanding balance on Eleanor Carter's account had been paid in full by an anonymous third party. She sat in the break room at May's Diner and held her phone to her ear for a long time after the call ended and the line went quiet. Patrice came in to refill the coffee pot and saw Emily sitting completely still with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that Patrice later described as someone standing in the middle of a miracle and not quite believing it was allowed to be real. Emily called Robert that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "She's going to be okay. The procedure went well." He said, "I'm glad." And there was a long silence on the line that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence between two people who have just said everything that matters and are letting it settle. And then Emily said, "I want to know about him. About my father. What he was like that morning. What he said. Everything." And Robert said, "I was hoping you would ask me that." They met 4 more times over the following month. At the diner. At a coffee shop. Once at the cemetery on November 9th, which arrived during that period, and Robert showed Emily the route he had driven every year and she stood at her father's grave beside a man she had never known existed and felt something shift in her chest that she didn't have a word for. It was not happiness exactly. It was not grief either. It was something quieter and more permanent than both. Something like understanding. She asked Robert what he needed from her. He said he didn't need anything. She said, "That's not what I asked." She asked again. And he was quiet for a long time. And then he said, almost to himself, "I would like to stop sitting in parking lots." And Emily looked at him for a moment and then nodded slowly and said, "Okay. We can figure out something better than parking lots. Can I ask you something? If you were in Emily's position, if you discovered that a stranger had been quietly protecting you for 15 years because of something your father did before you were old enough to remember it, how would you feel? Would you be grateful? Would you feel something more complicated than gratitude? Let us know in the comment. We genuinely read them. 1 year later, Emily Carter graduated from Cedar Falls Community College with an associate degree in social work. She had finished her final semester part-time while continuing to work both jobs and visiting her grandmother every Sunday. Eleanor recovered fully from the cardiac procedure and spent the following spring planting tomatoes in pots on her apartment balcony with a stubbornness that her cardiologist found both professionally alarming and privately admirable. Emily was there the Saturday the first tomatoes came in, and Eleanor made a salad and called it a celebration, which it was. Emily applied to a 4-year university program in social work and was accepted. Robert covered the tuition, quietly, through a scholarship administered by a small foundation he had quietly established years earlier, the Daniel Carter Memorial Fund, which had been distributing small anonymous grants to families in Cedar Falls facing sudden financial hardship for the past 11 years. Emily discovered this fact 3 months after her acceptance letter arrived, and she cried again. The second time in the story she cried not from sadness, and stood in her kitchen for a while without moving, and then called Robert and said, "You named it after him." He said, "It seemed right." She said, "It is right." Emily did not move in with Robert Hale. They did not become a surrogate family in any formal or announced way. What they became was harder to name and more real for that reason. They had coffee on the first Sunday of every month. He came to her graduation. She brought him a plant for his house because the place felt too empty and she said so directly, which made him laugh, which was, according to his driver Marcus, one of the few times Marcus had heard him laugh in 12 years. She sent him a card on November 9th every year. He kept them in his desk. He never mentioned it and she never asked. And on a cold Tuesday in November, exactly 2 years after Emily had sat outside Mercy Medical Center reading a text message she didn't understand, Robert Hale drove past May's Diner on Willowbrook Avenue and did not stop. Not because he no longer cared. But because he no longer needed to watch from a distance. Because Emily Carter, at 24, had something she had not had at 22. Not money. Not security exactly. but someone who knew her name and her father's name and the weight of both. And sometimes that is the thing that changes everything. Here is what this story asks you to hold on to. Daniel Carter did not stop on that highway because he thought anyone would remember. He stopped because he was the kind of person who could not drive past someone who needed help. He never got the chance to see what that choice set in motion. He never knew that it would ripple forward 15 years and find its way back to his daughter as anonymous groceries and paid rent and a scholarship bearing his name. He just stopped. Because that was who he was. And Robert Hale spent 15 years in parking lots and gray coats and plain white envelopes, not because he wanted gratitude, but because a man he knew for 20 minutes on the side of a highway had shown him what it looked like to do the right thing at personal cost. And he could not unknow it. So here is the question this story leaves with you. Think about the people in your own life who have done something quiet for you, something you may not have fully registered at the time. A teacher who stayed late. A neighbor who shoveled your walk without being asked. A colleague who covered for you during a hard week and never mentioned it again. We walk past these people all the time. We receive what they give us and we move forward, and we don't always stop to understand the full shape of what was offered. This story asks you to stop, just for a moment, and think about who has been your Daniel Carter. And who you might still become for someone else. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own life or someone you know, we want to hear from you. Tell us in the comments below. Do you believe that quiet kindness, the kind that expects nothing in return, always finds its way back? And think about this question too. If someone had been secretly protecting you for years without telling you, would you want to know the truth? Or would the not knowing have been enough? There is no wrong answer. We just want to know what you think. If you are watching this and this is the kind of story that reminds you why human beings are still worth believing in, please give this video a like. It takes 2 seconds and it genuinely helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are new here and you have made it all the way to the end of this, then you already know what kind of channel this is. Subscribe. There is another story coming, and it is one you will not want to miss.